She didn't scream. She didn't beg. The night Alpha King Riker Ashbourne looked at his fated mate, the woman carrying his bloodline, his heirs, his future, and chose someone else, Celine Voss did the one thing no one expected. She left. No tears on the Great Hall floor. No pleading in front of every pack leader on the continent. Just a woman walking out through the iron doors with nothing but the life growing inside her, and a silence so complete it cut deeper than any howl. 7 years later, that silence became a kingdom. Drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare leave before you find out what those children did to the man who threw their mother away. Yeah. The torches in the Great Hall of Mooncrest Keep burned the way they always did on treaty nights. Hot, deliberate, filling the vaulted stone ceiling with a haze that smelled like rendered fat and ambition. Riker Ashbourne stood at the head of the long table and did not look at the woman standing 10 feet behind his left shoulder. He had not looked at her in 3 weeks. Around the table, 12 Alpha representatives from across the northern and eastern territories watched him with the particular patience of predators, who understood that tonight's ceremony was not merely diplomatic. It was a demonstration. Strength was never just military in the pack world. Strength was who you chose to stand beside you. Strength was what you were willing to cut away. Celine Voss had not moved since she'd entered the hall. She stood where the protocol officer had placed her, behind the formal seating row, slightly to the left of the throne dais, exactly where a mate bond candidate was positioned before official recognition or formal rejection. Her dress was dark wool, pressed and clean. She had no pack insignia on her collar because she carried no pack title. Omega rank. No territory. No bloodline they could name publicly. She had come to this hall 3 weeks ago with nothing but the bond they both felt and the truth she was carrying inside her. Riker's hands were flat on the table. The Eastern Corridor Agreement, said Elder Vothan of the Stoneclaw Pack, his voice the texture of gravel dragged over iron. The final clause. Bloodline guarantees for the succession. Mooncrest must produce an acknowledged heir within 1 year of this union, or the corridor access reverts. Riker said, "Understood. And Luna Seraphine Vane will provide that heir." "She will." Seraphine sat at his right. She was everything the representatives had traveled to see. Third-generation alpha daughter of the Vane dynasty, silver blonde hair braided back with deliberate severity, hands still in her lap, eyes level. She had known since childhood how to occupy a room like a fact rather than a person. She did not look nervous. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a woman who had already calculated the result of every possible conversation in this hall and found them all satisfactory. Behind Riker, Celine breathed. He could hear it. He had always been able to hear it. The mate bond did not stop working simply because he had decided to override it. Her breathing was slower than it should have been, each exhale carefully controlled, and he had spent enough time in proximity to her to know what that control cost. He did not turn around. Elder Vothan produced the recognition scroll. Then we proceed to the formal address. The Alpha King of Mooncrest will acknowledge or reject any prior bond claims before this assembly, so the union of record is clean. This was the part Riker had prepared for. He had written the language himself, revised it twice, given it to his chief advisor Harlan to review for political clarity. It was 4 sentences. It would take less than a minute to speak. He opened his mouth, and Celine said, "I need to speak before that." The hall went very quiet. Riker's jaw tightened. He turned, because he had to, because 12 Alpha representatives were now looking at the woman behind him, and pack law required him to respond. He looked at her for the first time in 3 weeks. She looked like she hadn't slept. There were shadows beneath her eyes she'd tried to conceal and hadn't fully managed, and her jaw was set in a way that told him she'd been deciding to say this for longer than the walk from the antechamber. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her knuckles were white. "You don't have a standing right to address this assembly," Harlan said from the side wall, moving forward. He was a compact man, Harlan, with the particular energy of someone who'd made a career of managing difficult situations before they became expensive ones. Protocol dictates, the mate bond candidate has speaking rights before formal rejection under the Mooncrest Charter, said one of the representatives. A woman, Riker noted, Alpha Cressida of the Iron Bluff territory, who had the reputation of reading every legal document she ever signed, and twice more anything she hadn't. Article 9. It was written specifically to prevent rejection without cause. "She has cause to speak," another representative said. Harlan looked at Riker. Riker did not look at Harlan. "Say what you need to say," Riker told her. His voice came out even. He was proud of how even it came out. Celine met his eyes. She had gray eyes, not pale gray, but the kind of gray that looked like river water under overcast sky, deep and constantly moving. He had spent 4 months watching those eyes and telling himself the bond was a coincidence of biology, a chemical pressure that didn't mean what people said it meant, a thing that could be managed and eventually dismissed. He was still telling himself that. "I'm pregnant," she said. The hall did not erupt. It went the opposite of erupting. It contracted, every breath in the room pulling inward simultaneously, until the silence was so dense it had physical weight. Riker heard his own pulse. "I found out 6 weeks ago," Celine continued. Her voice did not shake. He had expected it to shake. "I didn't tell you because I needed to be certain. I went to the mountain healer outside the Eastern Pass, not a pack healer, because I didn't want this to become political before I understood it myself. She confirmed it. She also told me—" Celine stopped. Her jaw worked. "She told me it's twins." Someone at the table made a sound, a small sound, quickly suppressed. Celine kept her eyes on Riker. "I'm not telling you this to change what you've already decided. I know what tonight is. I know you've been deciding it for weeks. I'm telling you because you have the right to know it, and because these children have the right to have been told to their father's face." Riker said nothing. The silence stretched. Seraphine had not moved. Her hands were still in her lap. Her expression had not shifted. Riker did not look at her because he did not need to. He knew exactly what Seraphine Vane's face did with information she considered a complication. "You understand," he said finally, "that the timing of this claim—" "I'm not making a claim," Celine said. Her voice stayed flat. "I'm making a statement. There's a difference, and I think you know the difference." "The timing," he repeated, and his voice came out harder than he'd meant, "makes this look like a political maneuver. You understand how this looks." Something moved through her face. It was brief, and it was ugly, and it was gone before he could name it. But he had enough experience with humans under pressure to recognize what it looked like when a person absorbed a blow they told themselves they were ready for. "I understand," she said, "exactly how it looks to a room full of pack leaders who need your union to go through tonight." She paused. "I also understand that you're choosing to describe my pregnancy as a political maneuver rather than as a pregnancy." "Celine, I've said what I came to say." She unclenched her hands. He noticed she had to make a deliberate effort to do it. "You can proceed." Riker turned back to the table. His own pulse was so loud in his ears that Vothan's voice came through it like sound through water, when the elder began reciting the formal rejection preamble. Riker heard the words. He had written them. He spoke them when indicated, his voice doing the thing it always did in formal assembly, steady, measured, carrying authority without needing to be raised. He spoke the rejection. Pack law required a witness confirmation. 2 representatives acknowledged it. The scroll was marked. Behind him, Celine Voss was no longer his fated mate in any legal or binding sense. He did not hear her leave. He only knew she had because the bond, which had been a pressure at the back of his sternum for 4 months, constant and inconvenient as a bruised rib, dimmed slightly, the way a sound dims when the source moves away. He stood through the rest of the ceremony. He spoke the union words with Seraphine, whose hand was cool and dry in his, whose eyes met his with the composed satisfaction of a woman watching a long plan complete itself. The representatives applauded because treaty nights demanded it. Wine was poured. Vothan gave a speech about the new era of Mooncrest territory and Eastern Corridor stability. Someone made a joke Riker didn't register. He shook hands. He smiled when smiling was required. He performed the function of a king with the competence that 7 years of practice had made automatic. He did not go after her. He told himself that was the right decision every hour of that night, and for a significant portion of the following week. The morning after the ceremony, Harlan came to Riker's study with a list of logistical items and the careful expression he wore when he had something to say that he hadn't decided yet whether to say. Riker was at the window. The Mooncrest Valley spread below the keep. Market District, pack residential quarters, the wide stone training grounds, everything orderly and operating as it should. His kingdom, his responsibility. The Voss woman departed before dawn, Harlan said. Riker didn't turn from the window. I know. She had a pack escort to the Eastern Road, as protocol requires for any departing Bond candidate. After the boundary marker, she continued alone. A pause. She declined the offer of a destination escort. That's her right. Yes. Harlan set his list on the desk. I've had a few of the representatives' aides asking about the pregnancy announcement, whether there's a formal position from the Crown on the claim. There is no claim, Riker said. A claim requires legal standing. She explicitly stated she wasn't making one. Yes, I've communicated that. Another pause, longer this time. Riker. He turned then, because Harlan had been his advisor for 6 years and used his name precisely twice that he could remember, and both times it had been because something important was about to get said without the padding of protocol around it. Harlan was a careful man. He had a careful face. Right now that face was doing something uncomfortable. The twins, he said. What about them? If the healer's assessment is accurate, and the mountain healers in the Eastern Pass have a reputation for accuracy, then we're talking about 2 children carrying direct Ashbourne bloodline. He stopped. With Seraphine unable to... He stopped again. The agreement with the Eastern Territories requires an acknowledged heir within the year. I'm aware of the agreement. If Seraphine cannot... Harlan. I'm simply noting that... I heard you, Riker said. His voice was controlled. He had a great deal of practice controlling it. The children will be born outside official recognition. That's a consequence of the rejection. Harlan was quiet for a moment. A consequence you chose, he said. It was said without emphasis. Harlan had that particular skill, the ability to state a fact in a tone so neutral it hit harder than an accusation would have. Yes, Riker said, a consequence I chose. He turned back to the window. Below, the training grounds were filling with the morning pack. Young wolves running drills, older ones watching and calling corrections. The sound of it carried up, voices, movement, the particular rhythm of a community that knew how to function together. He had built this. His father had started it. Riker had built it into something larger, more stable, more defensible. He had made decisions every day for 7 years that served the whole rather than the parts. That was what leadership was. He watched a young female wolf correct her stance and immediately improve her reach by 4 inches. Her training partner laughed and shoved her shoulder. She shoved back. He stood at the window until Harlan took the list and left. What? Seraphine moved into the Luna quarters with the efficiency of someone who had been planning the arrangement of that particular room for longer than Riker had owned it. She had opinions about the furniture that she expressed once, clearly, with specific reasons, and then did not raise again after he confirmed the changes would be made. She attended the morning council sessions within the week and established, with a quiet consistency that was more effective than any declaration, exactly where she expected to sit and which topics she intended to speak on. She was, by every practical measure, good at this. She had grace in public. She handled pack members with the particular combination of distance and warmth that read as dignity rather than coldness. She learned names quickly. She remembered them. The senior council members, who had been the most vocal about the Eastern Alliance, watched her operate and their relief was visible. Riker and Seraphine had the kind of marriage that functions well in public and exists in a state of polite vacancy everywhere else. They did not argue. They did not have the kind of conversations that required arguing because they had reached an implicit agreement, early and without discussion, that their domestic space was an extension of the political one. Everything said between them was said with the awareness that it might eventually matter. She did not ask about Selena Voss. He did not speak about her. That was the arrangement, and it worked in the same way most things work when both parties are skilled and committed and mutually uninterested in examining what the arrangement actually costs. The Eastern Corridor Agreement went into effect. Trade moved. 3 minor territorial disputes were resolved under the new diplomatic framework. Mooncrest's reputation strengthened. Riker sat through sessions and made decisions and led his pack with the focused competence that had always been his primary tool, and the life of the kingdom arranged itself around him the way it always had. Time moved. Seraphine did not become pregnant in the first year. This was not immediately alarming. Biology was not a policy that could be scheduled. Riker said this to himself and to the one healer Seraphine agreed to consult, and the healer was professionally non-committal in the way healers were when they knew something they weren't going to say directly. Seraphine, when the subject arose in one of their more functional evenings together, sat across the dinner table and looked at him with her composed face and said, "I'm aware of the timeline." "I'm not pressuring you," Riker said. "I know you're not," she said. "You're very careful about how you apply pressure." He didn't know what to do with that statement, so he didn't do anything with it. The second year produced 3 Eastern Alliance negotiations that required his personal presence and a border conflict with the Gravethorn Pact that consumed 11 weeks. He handled them. Seraphine managed the domestic council. They functioned. The heir did not arrive. The Eastern representatives began sending letters with increasingly formal language about the Corridor Agreement succession clause. Harlan put those letters in a specific stack on the corner of the desk without comment. Riker read them and added them to the stack of things he was managing. But it was in the third year that the rumors started. They came in through trade routes first, the way most information arrived before it was worth anyone's formal attention. Merchants who'd traveled the northeastern territories, wolf scouts doing border confirmation runs, the occasional wandering pack member who'd spent time in the settlements beyond Mooncrest's eastern boundary. The content was consistent enough across sources that Harlan eventually put it in a report instead of mentioning it conversationally. The report was 3 paragraphs. Harlan had a gift for brevity. It described a settlement in Frostpine Valley, previously a minor border outpost, largely abandoned after the territorial restructuring 4 years prior, that had in the past several years become something more substantial. Not a pack in the formal sense, more of a gathering of unaffiliated and disbanded wolves who had found their way there and, apparently, stayed. The woman running it was described as a skilled healer and, by multiple accounts, as someone who knew how to build things. Infrastructure, supply systems, the kind of community organization that most settlements twice its size didn't manage. She was, the report noted, an omega of unaffiliated status. The report did not name her. Harlan had underlined the part about the settlement's population growth and left a small notation in the margin. Third-party accounts describe her children as unusual. Silver eyes. Notable physical capability for their age. Riker put the report in a drawer. He left it there for a week. Then he took it out and read it again. Then he put it back. He did not send scouts. He told himself that was the right decision for approximately 3 months. What changed it was not a report. What changed it was a conversation at the midwinter convening, the annual gathering of pack representatives that rotated through the major territories, and that year fell to the Iron Bluff hosting. Riker attended with a delegation of 4. Seraphine remained at Mooncrest, managing a trade arbitration that required a senior pack presence, and that she had, with characteristic efficiency, volunteered for before Riker could assign someone else. The convening was 4 days. Formal sessions in the morning, the particular social performance of diplomatic evenings, and in the spaces between, the actual information exchange that couldn't happen in structured settings. Riker moved through all of it with the attention he always brought to events where things got decided under the surface. On the third evening, a representative he didn't know, older male, bearing the insignia of a smaller Western territory, the kind of pack leader who showed up to these events for the networking rather than the formal agenda, found him near the outer hall where the fires were lower and the crowd thinner. "Ashbourne," the man said, with the slight hesitation of someone who had rehearsed an approach and was now deciding whether to use it. "I've heard something I thought was interesting from a trader who comes through the Frostpine route." Riker looked at him. "He says there are 2 children in the settlement there," the man continued. "Young ones. The woman running the place keeps them close, but the trader's seen them. He says—" The representative paused, and Riker watched him make a decision. "He says they have the Ashbourne eyes." The fire snapped. "What do you know about the Ashbourne bloodline markers?" Riker asked. His voice came out level. He had a great deal of practice with that. Only what anyone who's been paying attention knows, the man said. He met Riker's eyes without flinching, which told Riker this wasn't a man trying to gain advantage. He was delivering information and wanted Riker to know he understood the weight of it. The silver. It's specific. It doesn't present in diluted lines. You either have it or you don't. Riker was quiet. I'm not trying to make trouble, the representative said. I thought you should know what's being said, because it's being said in more places than just Frostpine. Riker thanked him. He used the precise, formalized version of gratitude that functioned as both acknowledgement and dismissal. The man left. Riker stood by the lower fire for a long time. The evening noise of the convening moved around him. Voices, movement, the political performance of 24 pack delegations existing in the same space without friction. He stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the pressure at the back of his sternum that he associated with the mate bond. Not the bond itself, that was severed and settled, legally and functionally. Just the memory of it, the ghost of a pressure. He thought about gray eyes. He thought about controlled breathing. He thought about a woman standing in a great hall, both hands clasped in front of her, knuckles white, saying, I'm not making a claim. I'm making a statement. He thought about a specific drawer in his study at Mooncrest, and a 3-paragraph report, and Harlan's underlined sentence about silver eyes. He thought about a word he'd used in that hall, maneuver. Standing in the outer corridor of the Iron Bluff convening hall, with the fire dying behind him and the weight of 3 years of management pressing down on him, Riker Ashbourne acknowledged, privately and without anyone to witness it, that he had known. He had known she wasn't lying. He had known the timing was what it was because that was how it had happened, not because she had arranged it. He had known the difference between a woman making a political play and a woman telling the truth about a pregnancy in a room full of people who had every incentive to use it against her. He had said, maneuver anyway. He had said it because Seraphine was in the room and the Eastern representatives were in the room, and 3 years of positioning had led to that night, and the cost of acknowledging the truth had been too high to pay. He had made the calculation and spoken the word, and stood through the ceremony and told himself it was leadership. He stood in the corridor and looked at that decision the way you eventually had to look at things you'd been putting in drawers, clearly, fully, without the softening effect of distance. It was not a complicated thing to see. He had chosen wrong, not strategically wrong, not politically wrong, fundamentally wrong, in the kind of way that doesn't get fixed by competent management or clean reasoning or the passage of time. He had looked at a woman carrying his children and called her honesty a threat, and then spent 3 years building a functioning life on top of that decision. The functioning life had continued to function. That was the thing about competent management. It kept the systems running regardless of what was underneath them. His kingdom was stable. His alliance held. His council worked. Everything operated. He was standing in a corridor at a diplomatic gathering with a stranger's account of 2 children with silver eyes echoing in his skull, and he understood, with the particular clarity that tends to arrive too late to be useful, exactly what he had done. He left the convening early the following morning. He told his delegation he had business to attend to in the capital. He took 2 riders instead of the usual 6, which made the lead rider, a careful woman named Dara, who had spent enough years with him to notice when something was wrong without asking about it, glance at him once in a way that asked the question without requiring him to answer it. They rode north. He told himself on that ride that he was going to assess a border settlement, intelligence purposes. The Frostpine territory was technically within Mooncrest's outer boundary, and he had a legitimate administrative reason to conduct a review. He told himself that for approximately a day and a half. By the time they reached the outer road that cut toward Frostpine Valley, he had stopped telling himself anything in particular. The settlement was visible before they reached it. That was the first thing that surprised him. Most border settlements were designed to be unobtrusive, positioned to avoid attracting attention that might become aggression. This one had a fire tower, wood and stone construction, visible from the ridge approach, clearly functional. Signal capability. The settlement itself, when the tree line broke, was larger than the reports had implied. Not a cluster of rough shelters, but a real community, with organized pathways between structures. What appeared to be a covered well. a long building that looked like a hall or communal space. Wolves moved through it. Not many, but steadily. People going about morning tasks with the easy purposefulness of a community that had its rhythms down. Riker stopped his horse on the ridge and looked at it for a long moment. Dara stopped beside him and also looked at it and said nothing. "Give me an hour," he said. "Sir, stay on the ridge." He handed her his reins and went the rest of the way on foot, which was not what pack leaders typically did when approaching settlements, but which felt, in this specific situation, like the right instinct. No delegation, no formal approach. If he came in with riders and formal presentation, whatever happened next would happen on political terms, and political terms were no longer the instrument that was needed here. He walked down into Frostpine Valley, alone. The settlement's outer boundary was marked with stone posts. Not a wall, not a fence, just markers. Clearly visible, clearly intentional. We know where we start and end. The first wolf who noticed him was a male, mid-20s, doing something with a fence section near the east side. He looked up, assessed Riker in the way a trained pack wolf assessed a stranger, and did not look alarmed. He looked careful. "You're approaching without announcement," the male said. "I know," Riker said. "Most people who do that are either lost or looking for something specific." The second one. The male straightened up fully. He was a big man, not as tall as Riker, but built heavier, with the particular kind of stillness that meant he was comfortable enough in his own capability to not need to demonstrate it. "What are you looking for?" Riker considered for a brief moment using his name. What that name did in rooms, what it would do here, the way it would immediately restructure everything and make the next 10 minutes about that instead of what he actually needed. "The woman who runs this place," he said. The male's expression shifted. Not much, just enough. "She's not," he started. "Mama's at the east well," said a voice. They both looked. A child stood on a wooden fence rail, not standing on the ground, standing on the top rail, balanced there with the particular unconscious ease of a kid who'd been climbing on things since she could walk. 7 years old, maybe. Dark hair cut bluntly at the jaw. And eyes that were the specific shade of silver that Riker had spent 34 years seeing in every mirror he'd ever looked into. His own eyes. His father's eyes. His grandmother's eyes. In the portrait that hung in the upper gallery of Mooncrest Keep, because she'd been the strongest alpha the bloodline had produced in 2 centuries. The girl looked at him with those eyes and said, "You're really tall." Riker's throat had stopped working properly. "Lyra." The male said her name in a tone that was controlled, but barely. "Go find your brother." The girl, Lyra, looked at Riker for one more second with the open, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to perform anything, then jumped off the fence rail and ran, her boots hitting the ground hard and her hair swinging behind her. She was fast. She ran like she'd been running since she could stand. Riker watched her disappear between 2 buildings. He became aware, with a specific kind of sensation he did not have good language for, that the large male was watching him. Not with hostility, with something more controlled and more complicated. "You should probably not be here," the male said quietly. Riker turned back to him. "I know. She's built something here. The people here—" He stopped. "She's built something, and you standing in the middle of it, uninvited—" "I'm not here to dismantle anything," Riker said. "You rejected her," the male said, flat, factual. No drama in it, just the statement of a thing that had happened. In front of 12 pack leaders, while she was pregnant, and you called it a political maneuver. Riker held that. "I know what I did," he said. "Then you know why she might not want you here." "Yes," Riker said. "I know why." He looked toward the east well, the direction the girl had mentioned. He had come down the ridge alone, no title announced, no delegation, no formal protocol. He had come because a stranger had described silver eyes at a diplomatic gathering, and the thing he'd been putting in drawers for 3 years had finally refused to stay there. He did not know what he was going to say to her. He had not figured that out. Somewhere on the road north, he'd stopped assuming he could prepare for it, because nothing he prepared was going to be adequate to the actual weight of standing in front of her and having to begin. But the girl's eyes had looked exactly like the eyes in his mirror, and the settlement around him was real. Real buildings, real people, real infrastructure, a real community that had been built in 3 years by a woman with no pack, no title, no resources, and no one to do the building for her. And there was a second child somewhere in this settlement whose name he didn't know and whose face he hadn't seen. He walked toward the east well. He did not have the right words. He walked anyway. He came around the long communal building and saw her. She was at the well with her back to him, pulling the rope hand over hand, and she was wearing work clothes, rough canvas and thick wool, her dark hair pinned up practically. Everything about her the opposite of the carefully pressed dress she'd worn in the great hall. A small crate sat beside her feet. She was working with the focused efficiency of someone with a task list and not enough hours in the day. She hadn't heard him yet. He stopped. In a minute she was going to turn around and she was going to see him standing in the settlement she had built without any help from him, in the life she had made for children he had abandoned before they were born, and whatever happened after that would happen, and he could not calculate or manage or prepare his way into a version of it that didn't start from what he had done. He had come down this ridge alone. He made himself keep standing there. "I know you're there," Celine said. She didn't turn around. Her hands continued working the rope, the bucket rising. "Kaylin spotted you from the training post. He has better range than I do." She brought the bucket up and unhooked it and turned. She looked at him. 3 years had done things to her face that 3 years of difficulty tends to do. Carved it down, settled it, taken whatever softness had been there, and replaced it with something that had been tested and found to hold. Her eyes were still the same gray, still river water under overcast sky. They looked at each other across the distance between the well and the corner of the building. Celine said, "Why are you here?" He opened his mouth, and from behind the communal hall, somewhere he couldn't immediately see, a child's voice, a boy's voice, shouted, sharp and sudden, "Mom, there are riders coming from the southern pass, a lot of them. They're not ours." Celine dropped the bucket. Celine did not run. That was the first thing Riker noticed. She moved fast, already pulling the crate toward the well housing with one arm and turning her head toward her son's voice. But she didn't run. She pivoted. There was a difference between those two things, and it lived in the body, in the way the spine held, in whether the legs were carrying you away from something or toward it. Celine moved toward the sound of Kaylin's voice with the specific economy of a woman who had spent 3 years making decisions under pressure and stopped wasting motion on fear somewhere in year 1. "How many?" she called back. 8, maybe 10. The boy's voice came from somewhere above. Riker looked up and found him on the roof of the communal hall, flat on his stomach, looking south. 7 years old and already positioned for observation. "They're not flying any mark. Get down from there." "I can see better from—" "Kaylin." A pause. Then the sound of boots on a roof and a boy dropping to the ground on the other side of the building with a thud that suggested he'd jumped rather than climbed. Celine was already moving. She crossed the distance to Riker in 12 steps and stopped 2 feet from him, and the gray eyes that had looked at him with 3 years of controlled distance were now doing something else entirely, running numbers, reading threat, the precise cold focus of someone whose children were on the same side of the wall as an approaching unknown. "You came alone?" she said. "2 riders, on the ridge. Get them down here." She didn't wait for his response. She turned to the large male, who had followed at a distance and was now standing close enough to hear. "Brennan, south positions. Anyone not combat ready goes to the hall." Brennan was already moving before she finished the sentence. Riker said, "Celine, can you fight?" The question was so direct it almost surprised him. Almost. "Yes." "Then we'll talk about why you're here after." She looked at him once more, not the Gray River assessment of the well, something sharper, something that clocked his capability and his position and made a decision about both in under a second. "Get your riders." He went back up the ridge at a run. Dara had already seen the southern approach by the time Riker reached her. She had her hand on her horse's neck and her eyes on the tree line, and her expression said she'd been doing the math and didn't like the result. 10 riders, she said. Armed. No pack colors, but the horses are quality stock. Someone funded this. "Down into the settlement," Riker said. She looked at him. "We're helping." She looked at him for one more second with the expression of a woman who had developed over years of service, the professional ability to execute orders without commenting on them. Then she remounted and signaled the second rider, and they came down the ridge. By the time they reached the settlement's interior, Celine had already reorganized the space. The people who weren't combat positioned had disappeared into the hall. He could see the door closed, could hear the bar dropping from the inside. The wolves who remained outside had spread into a loose, instinctive arrangement that covered the southern access points. Not trained military formation, but something that had its own logic, built out of people who knew this ground and each other. Brennan was at the south post. 3 others ranged out from him. Lyra was not among them, which Riker registered with a specific and unfamiliar sensation before he could name it. Kalen was at his mother's shoulder. Riker pulled up short. The boy was standing beside Celine with his arms loose at his sides and his chin level, not hiding behind her, not performing bravery, just present, positioned, watching the southern approach with the same calm assessment his mother had. 7 years old, with silver eyes and a spine like a fence post, and Riker felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. "Your son should be inside," he said to Celine low. "My son," she said, without looking at him, "doesn't take orders from people he hasn't decided to trust yet." Kalen looked at Riker sidelong, said nothing. The riders came out of the southern tree line at a walk, which was more deliberate than a run would have been, because a walk said, "We know you can see us, and we're not concerned about that." 10 of them, as Dara had counted. The horses were large and well-maintained. The riders wore no pack colors and no insignia, but they carried themselves with the particular posture of wolves who reported to someone significant. The one at the front was a broad man, dark-haired, with a jaw like an anvil, and the patient expression of someone who'd done this particular thing before and found it routine. He stopped his horse at the settlement boundary markers and looked at the arrangement in front of him without apparent concern. "We're here for the children," he said. "Straight transaction. No one gets hurt." The settlement was quiet. Selene said, "Whose children?" "The Alpha's twins." He said it the way you'd reference a category, not people. "Bloodline assets. Our employer has made arrangements." "Your employer," Selene said, "can make arrangements somewhere else." The man's expression did not change. He had the face of someone paid to complete a task who had learned long ago not to develop opinions about the tasks. "We don't have to do this the hard way." "You came to my settlement with 10 armed riders to take my children," Selene said. Her voice was level. Riker noted that it was more level now than it had been at the well, which told him something about what she did with her own fear. She put it somewhere and then operated without it, not because she didn't feel it, but because she'd decided it wasn't useful. "Explain to me which part of that wasn't already the hard way." The man looked past her. His eyes found Riker. Something shifted in his face. The first crack in the professional blankness. "Ashbourne," he said. Riker stepped forward to stand beside Selene. The riders behind the front man exchanged looks, not panicked, but recalibrating. Whatever they'd been told about the composition of the settlement's defense, it hadn't included the Alpha King of Mooncrest. "You're going to turn around," Riker said. "You're going to ride back through those trees, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that this location is under Mooncrest's active protection." It wasn't true, legally speaking. He had no formal declaration, no council authorization, no process behind those words. He was one man and 2 riders in a settlement he'd arrived at uninvited 3 hours ago. He said it anyway and let his voice carry the full weight of 7 years behind it. The front rider was quiet for a moment. Looking at the line in front of him, Selene, Riker, Brennan, and the others, the closed hall behind them, the ridge with Dara visible at the top, running the same math Dara had run earlier and arriving at a different conclusion than he'd started with. "We'll be back," he said. "I'll be here," Selene said. They turned the horses and went back into the tree line at the same deliberate walk. Riker watched until the last one disappeared. The settlement breathed. Brennan said, "That's not done." "No," Selene agreed. She turned and looked at the hall door. "Open it up. Tell everyone to stay in pairs until I say otherwise." She glanced at Kalen. "Go find your sister." "She's in the storage cellar," Kalen said. "She climbed in through the back window when you told everyone to go inside." Selene closed her eyes for approximately 1 second. "Go get her out." The boy went. Celine turned to Riker. They were standing closer than they'd been at the well. The distance the confrontation had collapsed between them was still there. 2 feet, maybe less. The kind of proximity that happens when people stand a line together and doesn't immediately recede. He was aware of it. By the quality of her stillness, she was aware of it too. "Bloodline assets," she said quietly. The controlled level was gone from her voice now, replaced by something colder and more specific. "That's what they called them. I heard. Someone knows." Her jaw tightened. Someone knows what they are and where they are and decided to send riders. Who knew about the twins besides the people in that hall 3 years ago? She looked at him. "You're asking me. I'm asking what you know. I know that I came out here and kept my head down and built something and told almost no one what the bloodline was." Her voice didn't rise. "I know that in 3 years nobody official has come anywhere near this valley, and I know that 10 armed riders just told me someone changed that." Riker said, "The Iron Bluff convening was 4 days ago." She read the implication immediately. Her eyes went sharp. "Someone at the convening. A representative mentioned the twins to me. Silver eyes. He'd heard it from a trader." He paused. If he heard it, others heard it before he did. Celine was very still. "Darius Blackthorne was at the convening," Riker said. The name landed. He watched it land. Blackthorne was the kind of alpha whose name landed like that. The Northeastern Territory, the aggressive expansion pattern, the particular brand of ambition that didn't bother dressing itself up as anything else. He'd been angling at Mooncrest's eastern corridor for 2 years through proxies and had gotten nowhere, which meant he'd been looking for a different kind of leverage. A bloodline that matched the Ashbourne markers would be exactly that kind of leverage. Not a military threat, something more permanent. Celine said, "He wants to claim them, or use them, as lineage proof for a competing succession argument. If he can establish custody, they're not going anywhere near him." The words came out quiet and absolute, with a finality that had nothing legislative about it. It was the tone of a statement that didn't require law behind it, because the person making it had already decided what they'd do if law was unavailable. "No," Riker said, "they're not." She looked at him. The gray eyes did their work, reading him the way they always had, the way that had unsettled him 4 years ago because he hadn't met many people who looked at him without the filter of his title, and her eyes never had that filter. "Why are you here, Riker?" she said. Not the version of the question from the well. This one was slower, quieter, more specific. He said, "I heard about the Silver Eyes from a stranger at a diplomatic gathering." "Yes." 3 years later." "Yes." She absorbed that. Her face did something complicated and then settled back into level. "And you rode north?" "I rode north." She looked away from him, toward the tree line where the riders had disappeared. Her arms crossed. Not defensively, he thought, just the body's way of holding itself together when it was carrying more than it wanted to hold. "Brennan's right," she said. "They'll come back, with more." "I know." "This settlement—" She stopped. Started again. "These people came here because they had nowhere else. Disbanded packs. Wolves without territory. I gave them somewhere. That's not—" Her jaw worked. "That's not a small thing to lose." "It won't be lost," he said. She turned back to him, and her eyes were direct and entirely without softness. "Don't make promises about my settlement." "I'm not making a promise. I'm stating what I intend. With 2 riders. I can have 20 here by nightfall and 60 by morning." The silence between them stretched. She was calculating. He could see it, not the emotional weight of it, which was enormous, and neither of them was going to address here in the middle of an active threat, but the tactical calculation. 20 riders by nightfall, 60 by morning, against whatever Blackthorne could move into position. Numbers and timing, and what it would cost her to accept what he was offering, and what it would cost her to refuse it. He had spent 3 years watching Seraphine think through political calculations. This was not that. Celine's face did not go smooth when she calculated. It went concentrated, every element present and accounted for, nothing hidden behind courtesy. "They're your children too," she said. It was not a request. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of the thing they had both been standing around since the moment she'd turned at the well and found him behind her. Yes, Riker said. You didn't act like it 3 years ago. No, he said. I didn't. Another silence. Longer. Kaylin doesn't know who you are, she said quietly. Lyra neither. I didn't tell them their father was a king. I told them their father was a man who made a choice, and we were the consequence of that choice, and we were going to be all right anyway. She paused. And we were. He held that. Let it sit where it needed to sit without deflecting it. I know, he said. Don't come in here and... She stopped, exhaled through her nose. Don't make this about what you need. If you're here for them. That's the only version of this I can work with right now. That's the version I'm here for, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward the hall and raised her voice to Carrie. Brennan, send a runner to the ridge for Ashbourne's rider. Tell her he needs to send for reinforcements. Use the Mooncrest fast route. She glanced back at Riker. Tell her 60, not 20. I want the margin. Brennan looked between them once. Then he moved. Riker turned to find Dara already coming down from the ridge, reading the situation with the professional accuracy that made her valuable. He met her at the settlement boundary and gave her the order in under a minute. She didn't ask questions. She took his written authorization, the small formal thing he always carried, the one that activated Mooncrest emergency protocol. And she mounted and she rode. When he turned back, Kaylin was standing 6 feet away. The boy had returned without Riker noticing. He stood with his arms at his sides and Lyra at his shoulder. The girl had debris in her hair from whatever cellar she'd been in, and a scrape on her palm she hadn't mentioned to anyone. They both looked at Riker with the same eyes. His eyes. Kaylin said, You're the one who was at the well. Yes. Brennan said you're helping. The boy's voice was level. No hostility, no warmth, pure assessment, the way Celine's voice went when she was reading a situation. Are you? Riker crouched down, which put him closer to the boy's eye level. Yes, he said. Kaylin looked at him for a long, unblinking moment, with those silver eyes that were his own eyes in a 7-year-old face, and Riker felt something in his chest perform a function he didn't have language for. Okay, the boy said, and turned and walked back toward the hall with his sister at his heels, both of them already talking in the low, fast way of children who'd been communicating in shorthand their whole lives. Riker stood up. Celine was watching him from the hall entrance. She said nothing. He said nothing. From the southern tree line, somewhere in the distance, a horse moved. Just one, barely audible, the sound of something repositioning rather than departing. They were already back. The sound from the tree line didn't come again. That was worse than if it had. Riker stood at the southern boundary markers and listened to the valley settle back into its working sounds. Someone moving crates inside the hall, a child's voice quickly hushed, the wind coming down off the ridge. And underneath all of it, the particular quality of silence that meant something with patience was waiting. Brennan came to stand beside him without being asked. They've got a position in the tree line, Brennan said, southeast corner. Maybe 2 of them. Watching. Counting what we have. That's my read. Riker looked at the tree line and did the math that the watchers were doing. 1 alpha, 2 riders, 8 wolves in the settlement who could hold a line, against whatever Blackthorn could move through those trees before Dara got back with reinforcements. The gap between now and 60 riders was the problem. Everything lived or died in that gap. How long has this settlement been known to the outer territories? He said. Brennan was quiet for a moment. People talk. We stopped trying to hide it about a year in. Celine said hiding it made it look like something worth hiding. She was right. Riker turned from the tree line. Get your people fed and rotated. Anyone on watch needs to eat now. Long night. Brennan looked at him with the expression of a man assessing whether an order from a source he hadn't authorized was an order he was going to take. Celine approved the reinforcements, Riker said. She didn't hand you to me. If you have a problem with my read, take it to her. A beat. Then Brennan moved. Riker went back inside. Celine had the twins in the hall's back room, not hiding them, he understood when he came through the door, but positioning them. The room had one window, high and small, and one exit that opened onto the northern side of the settlement away from the tree line. She had a pack on the floor beside Lyra with what looked like supplies for a fast move, and she was talking to Kaelin in the low, direct tone she used when she wanted him to understand something without alarm. She stopped when Riker came in. "Watchers at the southeast tree line," he said. "2. Counting our numbers." She nodded once. She'd already known or already assumed. "How long before your riders get back?" "Dara rides fast, 6 hours to the forward garrison, 20 minutes to mobilize. Call it 7 hours to first arrivals." Celine looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was starting its angle toward evening. 7 hours put first arrivals in the dark, which cut both ways. "They won't wait 7 hours," she said. "No." Kaelin said, "How many are coming?" Both adults looked at him. He was sitting on a low bench with his forearms on his knees and his silver eyes moving between them with the specific attentiveness of a child who had learned that being treated like he couldn't handle information was more dangerous than the information itself. Celine said, "We don't know yet, but more than the 10 from before." "Probably." The boy absorbed this. Lyra, beside him, was picking at the scrape on her palm with the focused inattention of a child pretending not to listen while listening to everything. Riker looked at his son and felt the word arrive in him with the full weight of something that had been true for 7 years and was only now being acknowledged. His son, sitting on a bench in a back room, preparing for a siege he shouldn't be anywhere near, with the calm of someone who'd been raised in a world where calm was a survival skill. "Lyra," he said. The girl looked up. "That hand needs to be cleaned. You don't want dirt in it if you have to move fast tonight." She looked at him with an expression that was weighing something. Not the advice, which was practical, and she knew it, but the source. Then she looked at her mother. Celine said, "He's right." Lyra got up and went to the supply pack and found the cloth and water herself. She didn't ask for help. She was 7 years old and she didn't ask for help. Riker turned back to the window. Chug. The first letter arrived 2 hours later. Not through any formal channel, through the front boundary marker, tied to a post with a strip of leather. Brennan brought it in without touching the seal, which told Riker Brennan had enough experience with hostile correspondence to know not to. The seal was Blackthorn's. A cracked iron circle, northern design, the kind of mark that had been pressed into wax at the tops of ultimatums for as long as Darius Blackthorn had been running his territory. Riker broke it and read it. Celine read it over his shoulder. He was aware of her breathing, close and steady, as her eyes moved down the page. The letter was short. Blackthorn's correspondence always was. He'd built a reputation for it, the kind of brevity that performed confidence. 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that the Alpha King of Mooncrest was apparently present, which was described as unexpected but not a problem. The second made a legal argument, compactly stated, clearly prepared in advance, that children born outside official recognition and outside pact territory existed in a classification that made bloodline claims contestable by any alpha with sufficient standing. The third paragraph said that Darius Blackthorn had sufficient standing, that he had 12 lawyers who agreed, and that he would be arriving at Frostpine at dawn to collect the children personally. Arriving personally. Riker set the letter down on the table. Celine picked it up and read it again. He watched her read it. Her face did not change. Whatever was happening behind her eyes when she read the phrase, "collect the children," she held inside her chest and didn't let out. "He's already here," she said. "He was already in position when he sent those 10 riders. He sent them to count us." "Yes. The letter is for witnesses. He wants it on record that he gave notice." Her jaw set. "He's planning this as a legal action, not a raid. Cleaner outcome for him." "Harder to fight a legal action than a raid," Riker said. "Harder for you." She set the letter down. "He doesn't have standing over my children because he doesn't have standing over me. I'm not pack affiliated. He can't claim pack jurisdiction. He can claim bloodline jurisdiction. If he can prove the Ashbourne markers, he can look at them," she said flatly. "The eyes aren't hidden." Riker was quiet for a moment. "The legal argument won't hold under Mooncrest Charter, but it'll hold long enough to take them while we argue it. That's the point." Celine turned away from him. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at the wood grain, and breathed. He waited. "What I built here," she said, very quietly. "These people. They came here because they'd been cut loose. No pack, no standing, no one who'd acknowledge them. I told them this was a place that would." She stopped. "If Blackthorn comes through that boundary with legal documentation and a pack of 12 lawyers, every single person in this settlement becomes collateral. He'll absorb the territory, reclassify them." She looked up. "They'll end up exactly where they started." Riker said, "That's not going to happen." "Stop saying things like that. Celine, you have been here for 4 hours." Her voice came out raw for the first time. Not loud, not breaking, but stripped of the controlled layer, the thing underneath showing through. "You don't get to stand in what I built and tell me what's going to happen to it. You don't have the history here to make that promise." He didn't argue with her. She wasn't wrong. "Tell me what you need," he said instead. She looked at him. The rawness was still there, barely contained, and behind it something older and harder. The look of a woman who had learned to identify which help was real and which help was someone else's version of taking over. "I need to know if Mooncrest will formally recognize this settlement," she said. "Not protection, recognition, legal standing. That shuts down the jurisdiction argument before it starts." "I can authorize that." "Can you? Or do you need council approval?" "Emergency declaration falls within Alpha authority. I can authorize it tonight." He paused. "It binds Mooncrest's resources to this territory. Permanently. That's not a small thing." "No?" she agreed. "It's not." They looked at each other across the table. He said, "I'll authorize it." She said, "Why?" The word was simple and direct, and it asked everything. Not why the tactical decision, not why the political calculation, but why? With all the weight of 4 years and a great haul and a word he'd said that he hadn't been able to take back. He said, "Because it's the right thing, and I'm late doing it, and I don't have any other answer that's worth giving you." Silence. Then she said, "Get your authorization written. I'll get Brennan." It was in the hour before midnight that the second thing happened. Riker was at the settlement's east post with Brennan, reviewing the positions when his second rider, the one who'd stayed on the ridge, came down fast and came directly to him, bypassing the normal entry points. The man's face was wrong. Riker saw it from 30 feet away and was already moving to meet him. "Message came up the ridge," the rider said. He was breathing hard, not from the run, from what he was carrying. "Came through the Mooncrest relay. Fast courier, addressed to you." He handed Riker a sealed document. The seal was the Mooncrest administrative mark, not Riker's personal seal, but the council office seal, which meant it had gone through official channels, which meant multiple people had handled it. Riker broke it. He read it in the light of the East Post torch. He read it once, and then he stood very still and read it again. Brennan watched him, said nothing. The document was a council notification. Under Mooncrest charter, the senior council retained the right to issue administrative holds on emergency declarations made without prior council consultation. A hold suspended the declaration's effect for a review period. This was a provision that existed for legitimate governance reasons, to prevent individual alphas from making binding territorial commitments in unstable states of mind. Someone had activated that provision. The hold was signed by 4 senior council members. The 5th signature, the one that would have blocked the hold, was Harlan's. His signature was absent. Harlan, who had been Riker's advisor for 6 years. Harlan, who had known where Riker was going when he'd left the convening early. Who had seen the file. Who had access to the relay system. Harlan, who managed Seraphine's correspondence. Riker's hand holding the document was very still. This was what it felt like. Not the explosion he might have expected from learning that someone close had worked against him, but the inverse, the implosion, the world taking a sudden step backward and revealing a depth he hadn't known was under the floor. 6 years. He had trusted Harlan with operational details he trusted no one else with, had relied on his judgment in the spaces where a leader's judgment ran thin from overuse. 6 years of access. 6 years of being the person who knew where Riker was, what he was deciding, and what information he needed to not have at a specific moment. He folded the document. He put it in his coat. He turned to his rider. When did this come through the relay? Timestamp on the courier's log puts it about 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago, Riker had been inside the hall with Celine and the children, discussing the letter. 2 hours ago, someone in Mooncrest had moved fast enough to activate a council hold on an emergency declaration before the declaration was even formally filed, which meant the council hold was not a reaction to the declaration. It was prepared. Someone had been ready for him to make that move. Someone had known he was coming to Frostpine before he arrived. He went back inside. Celine was at the main table with her authorization copy and Brennan's roster. She looked up when he came through the door and read his face immediately. "What happened?" she said. He put the folded document on the table in front of her. She read it. The hall was quiet enough that he could hear the torch on the south wall. He watched her read and watched her face do the thing it did when it was absorbing something that had structural implications. Not the surface of the news, but what the news meant 3 levels down. She set the document on the table. "Someone inside Mooncrest," she said. "Yes. Someone who knew you were here. Someone who knew before I arrived." Her eyes came up to his. The gray was very dark in the torchlight. "Seraphine," she said. He said nothing. She said, "It's Seraphine, Riker." He had been not saying it for 20 minutes, since the torch on the East Post, turning the document over and looking at the implications from every angle and arriving at the same place each time. Seraphine, who managed his correspondence and knew his movements and had 6 years of access to his chief advisor. Seraphine, who had a specific and significant interest in Riker, never formally acknowledging the twins. Seraphine, who had been in the position she occupied now because someone had produced evidence against Celine 4 years ago, evidence Riker had never fully examined because he'd been standing in a great hall with 12 pack leaders watching him, and the cost of examination had been too high. He said, "I don't have proof." "You don't need proof tonight," Celine said. "Tonight you need to figure out what you can actually do without a council authorization." He looked at the document, at its 4 signatures and 1 absence. "As Alpha King, I retain direct command of pack forces. Council holds apply to administrative declarations, not military deployments." She was very still. "You're saying you can still send the soldiers?" "I'm saying the soldiers are already coming because I gave Dara a military order, not an administrative one. The hold doesn't touch that." He paused. "What it touches is the legal protection, the formal recognition. Without the declaration, Blackthorn's lawyers have ground to stand on." Celine stood up from the table. She walked to the south window, the one that faced the tree line, and looked out at the dark. "He comes at dawn," she said. "Personally." "Yes." "With 12 lawyers and however many riders." "Yes." She turned around. And the thing Riker saw in her face then was something he hadn't seen from her in either of the times he'd been in a room with her. It was not fear, and it was not defeat, and it was not the controlled suppression of those things. It was something that had been compressed down for 3 years under the daily weight of building and providing and protecting, and it was rising now because she'd been pushed to the wall by people who had never stopped treating her children as a resource to be managed. It was fury, clean and cold and specific. "If he comes at dawn," she said, "he's going to find out what we built here." From outside, the sound of movement in the tree line, closer than the watchers had been, multiple contacts, and then from the northern approach, hoofbeats, hard and fast and multiplying. Dara's voice cut through the dark. "Garrison riders, Mooncrest Garrison, we're coming in." The hoofbeats kept coming, not 20, not 60, more. Celine looked at Riker. He said, "I told her 60. She went over my head." From the north, the settlement's perimeter filled with torchlight and the sound of horses and armed wolves pouring through the gap. And from the southern tree line, the watchers, whoever had been sitting patient and counting in the dark, went entirely, suddenly silent. The night balanced on its edge. And then Kalen appeared in the hall doorway behind his mother, still barefoot, his silver eyes finding Riker's in the torchlight. And he said 3 words with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had inherited his mother's instinct for the center of a thing. "Are we fighting?" Riker looked at him. He looked at Celine. He looked at the tree line, where Blackthorn's riders were repositioning in the dark, recalculating against a garrison they hadn't expected. and at the settlement around him, real and solid and built by one woman's refusal to accept the outcome he had forced on her. And he understood, standing in that torchlight with the document in his coat and betrayal already named and Dawn 4 hours away, that there was no version of what came next that he could manage from a distance or negotiate with clean hands. He was going to have to stand in it, all of it. "Get your boots on," he said to the boy. Kalen got his boots on in under a minute. Riker noticed because he was paying attention to everything now the way you paid attention when the gap between preparation and contact had closed to hours, and the boy moved through the hall with the same deliberate economy his mother moved with. No wasted motion, no performance of urgency, just the task and then the next task. He laced them himself. Didn't ask for help. Came back to the doorway and stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his silver eyes on the torchlit perimeter where Dara's garrison riders were spreading into position. Celine looked at him and something crossed her face that she didn't name and didn't show to anyone, but Riker caught it anyway. The look of a woman watching her son put on his boots for a night that shouldn't be his to carry, and choosing, because she had no other choice, to let him. "Stay in the hall until I call you," she said. "Mom, I'm not asking." He went back inside. Lyra was already there, cross-legged on a bench with her cleaned hand in her lap, watching the door with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is sometimes the most useful thing available. Celine pulled the hall door half shut and turned to the perimeter. Dara had brought 83 riders. Riker counted the torches and did the math. She had gone past his garrison authorization and pulled from the forward reserve, which was either going to be the best decision made tonight or the one that started a council crisis tomorrow. He found her at the north post, her horse still breathing hard, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who'd ridden through darkness at speed and arrived ready. "How'd you know to pull the reserve?" he said. "You took 2 riders to a border settlement," she said. "You never take 2 riders anywhere." She looked past him at the tree line. "What are we dealing with?" "Blackthorn. Personal arrival at dawn. His riders are already in the south tree line, repositioning since we lit up the perimeter." He paused. "He's got lawyers with him. This is a seizure action, not a military assault. He wants it to look legal." Dara processed this with the speed of someone accustomed to threats that came in multiple forms. "Then we need it to look more legal." "Working on it." "The council hold. I know about the council hold." She read his face. "Harlan." He said nothing. She said, "I'll need about 10 seconds to be angry about that, and then I'll be done with it." "Take your 10 seconds." She took them silently, her jaw tight, her eyes on the middle distance. Then she looked back at him. "Done. What do you need?" "Hold the perimeter. Nobody crosses the south boundary markers unless I give the word. If Blackthorn's people move before dawn, we respond, but we don't initiate." He paused. "And I need a courier to Mooncrest. Fast one. Personal letter, my seal. Direct to council member Aldrich. Nobody else." Aldrich was the one senior council member whose signature was not on the hold. Aldrich was also the one senior council member who had voted against Seraphine's appointment to the Luna chair and had been politely sidelined from every significant decision in the 3 years since. Riker had not thought about why that sidelining had happened with such consistency until approximately 40 minutes ago. Dara produced paper and a writing stick from her saddle pack without comment. Riker wrote the letter standing against his horse's shoulder. It was short. It named Aldrich as acting council authority in Riker's absence, cited the emergency provision that allowed that transfer, and authorized the Frostpine recognition declaration through Aldrich's office. He sealed it with his ring. Dara had a courier saddled and moving north within 4 minutes. The hour before dawn was the longest kind. Riker walked the perimeter twice, checking positions, checking sightlines, doing the physical work of staying present in a situation that kept pulling him toward the thing he couldn't fix yet. Harlan, Seraphine, the years of managed proximity, the specific and nauseating shape of trust used as a tool. He pushed it down. It would be there when the morning was done. Right now the morning needed handling. Celine walked the perimeter once, separately, and they passed each other at the east post without stopping, just the brief exchange of a nod that said, "I've checked this side and found it holding." It was the most functional thing they'd communicated, Riker thought, since he'd arrived. Stripped of history, stripped of the weight of what sat between them, just two people managing the same problem from different angles. He wondered if she found that easier or harder than the rest of it. He didn't ask. At the south boundary, Brennan had his three best people and a clear line of sight to the tree line's edge. The repositioning sounds had stopped an hour ago. Whatever Blackthorn had in those trees was settled into its final arrangement now, waiting for the same dawn everyone was waiting for. Riker stood at the boundary marker and looked at the dark tree line and thought about Darius Blackthorn, who he had met 4 times at diplomatic functions, and assessed each time with the particular clarity that came from understanding how a man's ambition was organized. Blackthorn was not reckless. He was patient and he was thorough. And he had learned sometime in his Alpha career that the most durable victories were the ones that looked inevitable in retrospect. He had spent 2 years working at Mooncrest's eastern corridor and gotten nowhere because Riker's defenses were too well organized to find a gap. So he had stopped looking for a gap in the defenses. He had looked for a gap in the man. And 3 years ago, Riker had provided one, wide and clear and devastating, by standing in a great hall and making the worst decision of his life. He stood at the boundary marker with the dark tree line in front of him and acknowledged that without condition or mitigation. He had made the gap himself. Everything that followed, the years of Blackthorn's preparation, the lawyers and the legal argument and the riders in the trees, was built in the space Riker had opened. That was the thing about catastrophic decisions. They didn't stay in the moment you made them. They grew forward through time, branching, and you didn't always see what they'd become until you were standing at the destination. He turned back to the settlement. He was going to need to be better than the man who'd made that decision. Not smarter, not more strategically competent. Better, in the specific way that required standing in consequences without deflecting them and doing what needed doing from that position instead of from the comfortable distance of management. The first gray showed at the eastern ridge. Checked. Blackthorn came at full light, not dawn's edge. He waited until the sun was above the ridgeline and the settlement was fully visible, and his arrival would be witnessed in clear daylight by every rider on both sides. He came down the south road with 20 riders flanking a central group of 6 men in formal council dress whose presence was the legal apparatus he'd been promising. Not soldiers, witnesses. He came at a walk that said, "I have done the calculations and I like my position." Riker was at the south boundary when he arrived. Celine was beside him. She had come out of the hall 20 minutes before Blackthorn appeared and taken a position at Riker's left without discussion, and he had not suggested she stand elsewhere because it was her settlement and her children and her right to be exactly where she was, and also because her presence changed the geometry of the confrontation in ways that were not nothing. Blackthorn stopped his horse 10 feet from the boundary markers and looked at the arrangement in front of him. The garrison riders spread across the settlement's width, Dara on the north flank, Brennan holding the east post, and at the center, 2 people standing at the boundary line. Something moved through his face. Brief, quickly replaced by the composed expression of a man who had planned for contingencies. "Ashbourne, God," he said. "This is unexpected." "Blackthorn," Riker said. "I have legal documentation authorizing a bloodline verification and custody assessment for 2 unregistered children currently residing in an unaffiliated settlement." He produced a document from his coat. "Under Northern Territory law, you're not in the Northern Territory," Riker said. "The children's bloodline claim crosses territorial. You're in Frostpine Valley," Riker said, "which is Mooncrest Outer Territory, which means Northern Territory law is not the operative framework." Blackthorn's expression held. "The Mooncrest Council has issued an administrative hold on any emergency declaration covering this settlement. That hold is active. This valley is currently unrecognized, which means you've been in communication with members of my council," Riker said, "without my knowledge, about a declaration I hadn't yet filed, which raises a question about how you knew to prepare a countermove before the move was made." Silence. One of the lawyers shifted in his saddle. "I have a letter," Riker continued, "from the Iron Bluff convening, where a representative told me he'd heard about 2 children with Ashbourne eyes from a trader on the Frostpine route." He paused. "I also have a council hold signed by 4 members of my administration, and I have a very clear memory of who in my household manages correspondence with Northern Territory contacts. He let that sit. Do you want to continue the legal presentation, or do you want to have the actual conversation? Blackthorne looked at him. The patience was still there, but it had tightened, the look of a man recalculating because the conversation had moved somewhere he hadn't positioned for. The children, Blackthorne said, carry the strongest bloodline markers produced in 2 centuries. You rejected them. They exist outside your legal protection. That is a fact, and it will hold up in any arbitration. Not anymore, said a voice. Riker's courier rider came over the North Ridge at speed, and behind him, a second rider carrying a document case with the Mooncrest administrative seal. The second rider pulled up and came directly to Riker and handed him a sealed document, still warm from transit. Aldrich had moved fast. Riker broke the seal, read the single page, handed it to Celine. She read it. Her face did not change, but her jaw released a tension he hadn't realized she'd been holding. Frostpine Valley is now formally recognized under Mooncrest jurisdiction, Riker said. Signed by acting council authority, countersigned by the full Eastern Alliance representatives who were copied at Aldrich's discretion. He looked at Blackthorne. The Eastern Alliance co-signature was a nice touch. Aldrich thinks ahead. Blackthorne was very still. The children, Riker continued, are Mooncrest heirs. They have legal standing. Your custody documentation is now an attempted interference in a sovereign succession, which carries a different set of consequences than a bloodline claim against unregistered children. One of the lawyers leaned toward Blackthorne and said something low. Blackthorne did not look at him. He was looking at Riker with the expression of a man who had built something carefully and watched it shift into a configuration he couldn't use, and was now deciding whether to accept the result or escalate past it. This was the moment. Riker had been in enough confrontations to know what it looked like. The second before a man decided whether his pride was worth more than his position. Blackthorne looked at the garrison riders, at the settlement behind Riker, at Celine beside him. He looked at Celine for a long moment in a way that made the back of Riker's neck tighten. Not aggressive exactly, but assessing, the look of a man pricing something he'd decided he still wanted. This isn't finished, Blackthorne said. No, Riker agreed. It's not. What happened next happened fast. One of Blackthorne's outer riders, not from the central group, one of the flanking 20, moved. Not toward the boundary line. Toward the settlement's east side, cutting wide. The kind of move that was planned for the moment the conversation became a distraction. He was going for the hall. Brennan saw it before Riker did and was already moving, his 3 people spreading to cut the angle, and the flanking rider was fast, faster than expected, and the east approach opened for half a second. Kalen came out of the hall door, not running, walking, with Lyra 1 step behind him, both of them in the open before anyone on the settlement side could get between them and the approaching rider. Riker moved. He cleared the boundary marker in 2 strides and cut the angle on the flanking rider at full speed, and the impact was the kind that had nothing managed about it. Shoulder into the rider's horse's flank, enough force to turn the animal, the rider going sideways and catching himself and wheeling to face Riker with the expression of someone who'd expected an easier path. The rider was bigger than Riker. That happened sometimes. Riker had stopped being surprised by it in his mid-20s. He hit the man twice, fast, specific, the places that shut the body down without requiring time, and the rider went to his knees and stayed there. Riker turned. The east approach was closed. Brennan's people had it. Dara had moved the garrison line forward while the attention was east, and Blackthorne's riders were now inside a containment that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The lawyers were very still on their horses. Blackthorne had a blade in his hand, not pointed at anyone, just present. Riker walked back through the boundary and stopped in front of him. His shoulder was going to hurt tomorrow. Something had caught him at the wrong angle in the impact. He didn't look at it. He looked at Blackthorne and said very quietly, "Put that away." Blackthorne looked at him with the blade in his hand and the calculation behind his eyes and the specific knowledge that the moment had moved past what he'd planned for. His riders were contained. His lawyers were witnesses to an attempted flanking maneuver during a legal proceeding. The document in Riker's hand, co-signed by Eastern Alliance representatives, was a political disaster if this escalated. But the blade was in his hand, and Darius Blackthorne had not built what he'd built by backing down from positions in front of witnesses. My quarrel, he said slowly, was never really with you. He looked past Riker, at Celine. And Riker understood in the specific, cold way of a man reading a situation correctly for the first time what Blackthorn had actually been building toward, not the children as bloodline assets, or not only that. The settlement. The woman who ran it. A community of unaffiliated wolves who answered to someone with no pack standing and no alpha title, and who had in 3 years built something that functioned better than territories twice its size. That was the threat. Not the twins. Her. A woman with no official standing who commanded the kind of loyalty that took most alphas decades to build, who had demonstrated that you could create stability and safety without pack hierarchy, whose existence was a quiet argument against the entire structure that men like Blackthorn ran their power through. The twins were leverage. Celine was the actual target. Riker stepped directly into Blackthorn's line of sight. "Look at me," he said. Blackthorn looked at him. "The next move you make," Riker said, "ends either with you leaving this valley or with you being held under Mooncrest authority pending an investigation into council interference. Those are the options." He paused. "Choose." The blade stayed in Blackthorn's hand for 4 more seconds. Then he sheathed it. "This isn't finished," he said again. "You keep saying that," Celine said from behind Riker, and her voice carried the particular quality of someone who has stopped being afraid of a threat and started being tired of it. "Ride out, or we start the paperwork." Blackthorn looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned his horse. His riders fell in around him. The lawyers followed. They went back down the south road at the same deliberate walk they'd arrived with, and the tree line absorbed them, and the sound of hooves faded into the morning. The garrison held its positions. Nobody moved for a full 30 seconds. Then Brennan exhaled. Then the settlement breathed. Riker turned. Kalen was standing 6 feet away with his sister beside him, and his eyes on the south road where Blackthorn had gone. And on his face was the expression of a child who had just watched something significant and was in the process of understanding what it meant. He looked at Riker, then at the rider still on his knees at the east approach. "You hit him twice," Kalen said. "Yes. Why twice?" "Once to stop him, twice to make sure." The boy looked at this information the way he looked at most information, seriously, filing it. Celine came through the boundary line and stopped in front of her children and put one hand on each of their heads, not pulling them close, just contact. Her hands were shaking slightly. She let them shake and didn't try to stop it. Riker looked at that, at the controlled woman who had held everything together through a night of threat and preparation and confrontation, allowing her hands to shake now that it was over, in front of her children who already knew she was not made of stone and didn't need her to pretend otherwise. He looked at the south road. Blackthorn was gone. But gone was not finished, and Riker had known that since the moment the blade came out. This had been a demonstration of force, of capability, of the shape of what Blackthorn was willing to do. The lawyers had witnessed everything. The council hold was still in some form of active dispute. Harlan was still in Mooncrest with access to systems Riker needed to shut down. Seraphine was still Luna. The document in his hand was real, and it mattered, but it was one piece of a structure that had been built against him by people inside his own walls, and he was standing in a valley 4 hours from home with a garrison that needed to return to its forward post, and a set of problems that could not be solved from Frostpine. He looked at Celine. She had dropped her hands from her children's heads, and she was looking at him with the gray eyes that had been reading him correctly since the first moment she'd turned from the well and found him standing there. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had not slept and had run on focus and necessity through an entire night and was now in the first minutes of the aftermath, where the body starts presenting its invoice. She said, "You need to go back." "Yes." "Harlan. Seraphine." She said the names flatly. "That's the rest of it. That's the rest of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was full now, coming over the ridge and across the settlement, and it found every line of her face, the exhaustion, the steadiness, the complicated thing that happened when she looked at him that she hadn't named and he hadn't named, and both of them were aware of. "Riker," she said. He waited. "What you did this morning?" She stopped. "With the rider, moving before I could..." The children were in the open. I know why you did it. She held his eyes. I'm not saying it didn't matter. He held that. Let it be what it was without adding to it. Behind her, Kaylin had found a piece of the settlement fence to sit on and was explaining something to Lyra in a low, focused voice, gesturing toward the south road. Explaining the morning to his sister the way he'd processed everything, with the serious, clear-eyed directness of a child who had never been told the world was simpler than it was. Riker looked at his son, explaining the world to his daughter on a settlement fence in a valley they'd built without him. He said, I'll be back. Celine said, I know. And in the way she said it, not warm, not forgiving, not any of the things he hadn't earned yet, she said it like a fact, like something that had been established and didn't require debate. Dara appeared at his shoulder with his horse. He mounted. He took one more look at the valley, at what had been built here in 3 years by one woman with no resources and no title and no one to do it for her, at the people emerging from the hall now that it was over, at the twins still on the fence, at Celine standing in the morning light with her hands finally still. He turned the horse north, and from behind him, carrying clear in the morning air, Lyra's voice, Kaylin, do you think he's coming back? And Kaylin, after a pause that had his mother's quality in it, honest, measured, unwilling to offer comfort that wasn't grounded in something real, yeah, I think he is. The road north opened in front of him. Whatever he was riding back to, he was riding back to it without the version of himself that had stood in a great hall 4 years ago and chosen distance over truth. That man had built the gap Blackthorn had tried to walk through. He had no use for him anymore. Mooncrest was 4 hours away. Seraphine was there, Harlan was there, and the council hold on his authorization was a document that someone had prepared before he'd even filed the declaration, which meant the preparation had started the moment his rider left the convening, which meant someone in his household had been watching him closely enough to know exactly when he'd decided to act. He rode north into the full morning and let the implications of that land fully in his chest without managing them. By the time the ridge disappeared behind him, he had already decided exactly what he was going to say when he walked through the doors of Mooncrest Keep. He rode through the gates of Mooncrest Keep at midday. No announcement, no formal return procession. He came in with Dara and the second rider and the dust of 4 hours on all of them, and the gate wolves stepped aside with the trained reflex of people who recognized their alpha and knew better than to make ceremony out of a face that looked like his did. The keep's inner yard was its usual midday self. Staff crossing between buildings, a weapons delivery being logged at the armory door, 2 council aides moving fast toward the east wing with document cases. Everything functioning, everything orderly. The machine of governance operating exactly as it had been designed to. Riker looked at it and felt the particular sensation of seeing something familiar from the wrong angle. The same objects, the same arrangements, and underneath them a different structure than the one he'd believed he was standing on. He handed his horse to the stable hand and walked inside. He found Harlan in the records room, not hiding. Harlan was not the kind of man who hid. He was the kind of man who stayed exactly where he was supposed to be and relied on the appearance of normalcy to carry him through the first critical hours of a situation. He was at the long table with 3 documents open in front of him and a cup of something cooling at his elbow, and he looked up when Riker came through the door with the expression of a man who had been waiting and had decided during the wait that calm was his best available position. Riker closed the door. He pulled the chair across from Harlan and sat down. He did not say anything immediately. He had 4 hours of writing to decide what he was going to say, and he had not used them for that. He had used them for something else, for letting the full shape of it arrive without interference, for sitting with the specific weight of 6 years of proximity to someone who had been feeding information out of those years and into the hands of people who could use it. He had been angry. Past the anger was something quieter and more durable. "How long?" he said. Harlan's hands were flat on the table. He did not pretend not to understand the question. 3 years, he said, after the rejection. Seraphine. Yes, Riker held that. She approached you. She presented it as protecting the kingdom's stability, Harlan said. The heir situation, the Eastern Corridor. If the twins were ever legitimized. He stopped. She made a case that the kingdom's stability was worth managing. Managing, Riker said. I believed her. Harlan's voice was even. He had the particular composure of a man who had already passed through his own reckoning with what he'd done and arrived at a stripped-down version of honesty because there was nothing else available. For the first year, I believed the case she made. After that, he looked at his hands. After that, I was already in it. Riker was quiet for a moment. The evidence, he said. 4 years ago. Against Celine. Harlan was still. The evidence that made it easy for me to call her announcement a political maneuver, Riker said. The file that showed up in my briefing 3 days before the ceremony. The one I didn't examine carefully enough because the timing made the narrative convenient. He watched Harlan's face. Where did that come from? Harlan said, Seraphine's office. Fabricated. Yes. Riker sat with that. He had known, in the way you sometimes know things you've decided not to fully examine, that the file had been too convenient, information that confirmed the decision he was already under pressure to make, arriving exactly when it needed to arrive to close off the examination he might otherwise have done. He had accepted it because accepting it was easier than the alternative, and he had told himself he was making a strategic decision when he was actually making a convenient one. Harlan had known. Harlan had known the origin of that file and had said nothing, and had continued to say nothing for 4 years while Celine Voss raised 2 children alone in a border valley. I'm going to need your resignation, Riker said, today, before the council session. Harlan nodded once. He did not argue. He did not offer context or mitigation. He had enough remaining dignity to accept the weight of what he'd done without trying to distribute it. The council members who signed the hold, Riker said, they don't know about the file. Seraphine kept that contained. They signed the hold because she presented it as protecting established succession protocol. They believed they were doing their jobs. I'll determine that individually. Riker stood up. Your resignation letter will name administrative mismanagement and failure of advisory duty. Nothing else. The investigation into the file is separate and will be handled by external review. He paused. If you have any documentations, correspondence, records, anything that touches Seraphine's role, I need it on my desk in the next 2 hours. Harlan said, It's already there. Riker stopped. Top drawer, Harlan said quietly. I put it there this morning. Riker looked at him, at the careful, compact man who had been his closest operational advisor for 6 years, and who had, somewhere in those 6 years, made a choice and spent every day after it in the particular prison of a person who knows exactly what they did and has to keep doing it. He said nothing. He left. Seraphine was in the Luna receiving room. She knew he was coming. The keep was not large enough for his return to go unannounced, and Seraphine had always been a woman who knew what was moving toward her before it arrived. She was standing when he came in, not seated, which told him she had made a deliberate decision about the posture she wanted. She wore the Luna formal blue. Her hair was immaculate. She had the composed face she'd worn in the Great Hall 4 years ago, and at every formal function since, the one that was so thoroughly constructed it had become, over time, indistinguishable from her actual face. Riker put Harlan's documentation on the table between them. He did not speak. She looked at the documents. The composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then something moved through it, not breaking, not collapsing, but a kind of settling, the way a wall settles when the ground under it shifts. The architecture remained, the foundation revealed itself. He gave you his records, she said. Yes. I told him that would never... She stopped. The composed face made a correction. The file, Riker said. 4 years ago. She was quiet. The evidence against Celine Voss, he said. The material that showed up in my briefing 72 hours before the ceremony. The material I didn't examine because it confirmed what I'd been positioned to believe. His voice was level. He had made a decision on the road north to keep it level, not because he felt level, but because volume was not the instrument this required. You fabricated it. She looked at him with her composed face and made another decision. He could watch her make it. The specific moment a person decides that the position they've been holding is no longer tenable, and that the most controlled available exit is the one where they choose the terms of its collapse. The kingdom needed stability, she said. The Eastern Corridor, the succession. You were going to compromise everything for a bond that was biology, not strategy. You forged evidence against a pregnant woman. She absorbed the directness of that. I protected this kingdom. You protected your position. Those were the same thing. He looked at her, at the woman who had sat beside him at formal functions and handled pack members with grace, and managed the Luna chair with genuine competence, and who had built all of it on a document she'd created in her office to make a decision easy for a man who'd been looking for a reason to make it. Were you ever going to tell me? He said. It was a real question. He wanted to know. She said, no. He respected the honesty of that, in the grim, specific way you could respect a thing that had nothing good about it. The Luna title, he said. The council will address the formal process. You'll be present for that session. Riker, the exile's determination will go through council review. I won't make that call unilaterally. He paused. That's more process than you gave her. She closed her mouth. She looked at the documents on the table between them. 6 years of her work, a fabricated file, correspondence with a man she'd turned into an instrument, and she looked at them with the face of a woman who had believed genuinely and completely that what she was doing was necessary, and who was now standing in the first moments of understanding that belief was not the same as being right. He did not know if that understanding would last. That was not his to manage. He picked up the documents and left. Tvom. The council session was that afternoon. It ran for 3 hours. Riker presented the documentation, named the fabrication, named Harlan's role, named the council hold for what it was. The 4 members who had signed it sat with the specific discomfort of people who had acted in good faith and are learning what their good faith was used for. Aldrich, on Riker's right, said almost nothing. He had said almost nothing for 3 years, and the weight of that silence had its own statement. Seraphine appeared for the formal address and said what needed to be said with the controlled precision she'd applied to everything in her public life. She did not deny what the documentation showed. She made her case about stability and succession and what she'd believed she was protecting, and the council heard it, and when they deliberated, Riker stepped out and stood in the corridor and looked at the stone wall and breathed. He thought about a great hall, about 12 pack leaders, about a woman standing with her hands clasped and her knuckles white, saying, I'm not making a claim. I'm making a statement. He thought about the word he'd said, maneuver. He thought about the fact that he had let that word come out of his mouth, not because he believed it was true, but because it was available and it was useful, and it cost him less than the truth would have in that room at that moment. He had made a calculation and spent 4 years living in the result of it, and the result had ramified outward into things he hadn't calculated. A woman in a border valley, 2 children on a fence, a settlement built by refusal, a man in a records room who had made his own calculation and been trapped in it. This was the thing he had not fully let himself look at until now, in a corridor outside a council room, with the afternoon coming through the narrow window. He had not been betrayed into the Great Hall decision. Seraphine's file had made it easier, had sealed a door that might otherwise have stayed open, but the man who had stood in that hall had been looking for permission to do what he'd already decided. He had to own that separately from what Seraphine had done. They were not the same thing, and they did not cancel each other. The council came back with their determination. Seraphine was stripped of the Luna title. Her access to Allied territories was to be formally reviewed, with a preliminary finding of restricted movement pending the external investigation into the fabricated file. The 4 council members who had signed the hold received formal censure and were removed from succession-related decisions pending review of their advisory relationships. Aldrich was appointed acting council lead. Riker ratified it. He walked out of the council room into the late afternoon and stood in the courtyard and breathed the cold air and felt the particular sensation of a structure coming down, not collapsing chaotically, but being deliberately dismantled, stone by stone, each piece placed somewhere you could see it. He had spent 7 years building Mooncrest into something stable and functional and strong. He had believed the stability was the achievement. Standing in the courtyard with the sun going down behind the western wall, he understood for the first time that stability built on a false foundation was not stability. It was an agreement between people who needed not to look at what was underneath. He had been the person who needed not to look. He was looking now. It was not comfortable, and it was not clean, and it did not produce the sense of completion that he might have expected. It produced something more like the beginning of work, the particular feeling of a man who has cleared the site and is standing in front of what actually needs to be built. He went to find his horse. He came back to Frostpine 4 days later. He came with 2 riders and a document case and no announcement, the same way he'd arrived the first time, because arriving without announcement was the only honest version of arriving. It said, "I'm not performing this, I'm doing it." The settlement was mid-morning. The fire tower was manned. The pathways between buildings were moving with the purposeful rhythm of a community that had its own momentum now, uninterrupted by the drama that had moved through it. Wolves who had been nowhere before were somewhere now, and the texture of that, the specific quality of people who had found ground to stand on, was visible in how they moved through the space Celine had built for them. He came in through the north approach, and Brennan saw him first and said nothing, just looked at him for a moment with the assessment he always applied, and then stepped aside. Celine was at the communal hall. She was talking to a woman he didn't know about, something that required a hand gesture indicating a building's structural element, and she finished the conversation before she turned, which told him she'd heard him arrive and made a decision about what to do with that information before addressing it. She turned. He looked at her in the morning light. The dark hair, the practical clothes, the face that had been carved down and settled by 3 years of difficulty into something that had been tested and found to hold. She looked at him with the gray eyes. He said, "Seraphine is removed. The council determination is final. The file she fabricated, the one that made it easy for me to say what I said in that hall, is documented and in external review." He paused. "I wanted you to know that before anything else." Celine was quiet for a moment. "The file," she said, "evidence placed in my briefing before the ceremony, designed to make your announcement look like a play." He held her eyes. "I used it as permission to say what I'd been positioned to say. The file made it easier. I made the choice." She heard the distinction. He watched her hear it, the way her face processed the separation of those two things, what had been done to her and what he had done. She said, "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you deserve the full account. Not the version where everything was done to me by people who manipulated the situation." He said it steadily. "I had options I didn't take. That's mine." The morning moved around them. Someone across the settlement was working on a roof section, the sound of it carrying in the cold air. 2 children, not his, younger, chased each other between the buildings with the total commitment of small people for whom the world contracted to the immediate thing. Celine said, "The council determination, the recognition declaration. Permanent. Aldrich countersigned. Eastern Alliance representatives are on record. Blackthorn's legal team withdrew their documentation 2 days ago." He paused. He'll look for another angle, but not this one. Not while there are 4 Eastern Alliance signatures on the recognition. She absorbed this. Something in her shoulders released, not dramatically, not a visible collapse of relief, just a small recalibration, the body acknowledging the removal of a weight it had been carrying. "Kaylin and Lyra," he said, "the legal recognition of their standing as heirs." He met her eyes. "I want to do that right. Not by my determination alone. I want to ask you how." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me," she said. "It's your call," he said. "It has been since the beginning. I'm not here to tell you how the next part goes. I'm here because this is where they are, and this is where you are, and I have things to answer for that don't get answered from 4 hours away." The silence between them was different from the silences before, not the compressed tension of people managing proximity to something unresolved, something else. The kind of quiet that happens when 2 people have said the true things and are standing in the aftermath of that before the next thing starts. She said, "There are conditions." "I know." "Not suggestions," she said. "Conditions, legal and operational. I want equal authority on decisions that affect this settlement and the people in it. I want transparent council access, not reports filtered through advisors. I want codified protections for unaffiliated wolves in Mooncrest territory, permanent, written into the charter." She paused. "And I want it known, publicly, formally, That Kaylin and Lyra are heirs not because of what runs in their blood, but because of what they've already demonstrated. They earned it here. That's the record I want. He said, yes. She looked at him. All of it. All of it, he said, without revision and without a timeline that lets me manage the implementation. You want a lawyer present when the charter amendments are drafted. Name whoever you want. She studied him. The gray eyes did their full work, looking for the management, the calculation, the version of agreement that reserved exit routes. She was very good at finding those things. She had developed the skill the hard way. You're different, she said quietly. I went home and took apart what I'd built, he said. Some of it needed to come down. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said. I'm asking you to give me something to prove it to. Conditions, oversight, whatever structure you need. I'll work inside it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Kaylin wants to see Mooncrest. The shift in her voice was subtle, but it was there. Something that had been closed beginning to come off its latch, not swinging open, just the pressure releasing. He said, I'll take him whenever you say. Lyra, too. Both of them. Together. I want to be there, she said. The first time. Yes, he said. I'd want that too. She looked at him once more with the gray eyes, and whatever she found there she kept to herself, which was her right. She had always been careful about what she gave away, and she had learned through 3 years of raising 2 children alone exactly which things were hers to keep. She turned toward the hall and raised her voice. Kaylin, a pause. Then boots on the hall floor and the door opening and the boy appearing with his sister 3 steps behind him, both of them reading the courtyard the way they always read everything. Completely, quickly, with the eyes that were Riker's eyes in their faces. Kaylin looked at him. You came back. I said I would. The boy considered this for a moment with the serious expression that was his constant register. Then he looked at his mother. She gave him one small nod. Not permission, just information. He looked back at Riker. Lyra wants to see the training grounds, he said. She's been asking about them since you said you had a garrison. Lyra beside him did not deny this. Riker looked at the girl, at her scrubbed hand and her blunt-cut hair and the eyes that had looked at him from a fence rail the first morning, and said, You're really tall with the complete uncomplicated directness of someone who had learned to say what was true. The training grounds are good, he said. You'd both do well there. Obviously, Lyra said. Celine made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. It was the first sound like that he'd heard from her since he'd walked back into her valley, and it moved through the cold morning air and settled somewhere in his chest in the particular way of things that are small and mean more than their size. They went to Mooncrest 3 weeks later, all 4 of them. Riker rode in front with Kaylin, who asked questions about the territory they crossed with the focused persistence of someone building a map in real time. Celine rode with Lyra, who mostly observed and said nothing, which Riker was already learning meant she was storing everything for later. He brought them through the front gates. No ceremony, no announcement. The keep staff saw what they saw and filed it where they filed it, and if there was talk in the corridors that evening, and there was, because there was always talk, it ran along lines that could not be managed or controlled, only let move through the system the way truth eventually does. He showed them the training grounds first because Lyra had asked, and because Kaylin's eyes went immediately to the formations and the sight lines, and he deserved to see them close. He showed them the council room. He showed them the gallery on the upper floor, and he stopped in front of the portrait at the far end, the one that had hung there since before he was born. The woman with the severe bearing and the eyes that were the specific silver that had shown up 3 years later in a valley 4 hours north. Kaylin stood in front of it for a long time. Celine came to stand beside Riker while the boy looked at the portrait. She said very quietly, She looks like him. Yes, Riker said. He gets that from you. The stubbornness, too, I think. She looked at him sideways with the gray eyes. Definitely that. They stood in the gallery with their children in front of the portrait of a woman who had been the strongest alpha the bloodline had produced in 2 centuries, and the afternoon light came through the high windows and lay across the old stone, and Riker felt something settle in him that had been in motion for 4 years. Not resolution in the clean sense, not the closing of a door, but the specific sensation of a foundation being placed under something that had been built in the air. It had cost what it had cost. He could not make that different. The 3 years were real. The Great Hall was real. The word maneuver had been said in front of 12 pack leaders, and it lived in the permanent record of what he had done. The fabricated file had made it easier, but the choice had been his, and that was not going to change. What he could do was what you do after the worst decision you've ever made. Not undo it, not manage it into something more comfortable, but stand in the full weight of its consequence and become the version of yourself that knows better. Not because knowing better erased the cost, because the people in front of him deserved the version of him that had paid the cost fully and learned what it was for. Kalen turned from the portrait. He looked at Riker with the silver eyes. "She was Alpha," he said. It wasn't a question. "The best one this bloodline produced," Riker said. "Until now." The boy held his eyes for a moment. Then he looked at his sister. Some communication passed between them in the wordless shorthand of children who had been each other's primary company for their whole lives. Then Lyra said, "Is there food? We rode for 4 hours." Celine made the sound again, the one that lived near a laugh. Riker said, "Yes, there's food." They walked out of the gallery together. He did not reach for Celine's hand. That was not where they were yet, and he understood the distance that remained and respected it the way you respect something that has to be built correctly, rather than quickly. She had laid out the conditions, and he had accepted them without revision, and the work of demonstrating that acceptance was not a thing that completed itself in a single morning in a courtyard. It was a daily thing. He knew that now in the specific way you know things that cost you enough to learn. She walked beside him through the gallery and down the stairs and through the keep, that she had never been inside before, and that was going to require its own adjustment. And she walked through it the way she walked through everything, with the straight spine and the level eyes and the particular quality of a woman who went through difficult terrain by moving forward rather than around. She had done that without him for 3 years. She would not need him to do it now, but she had agreed to let him walk beside her, on her terms, on a foundation that named accountability before it named anything else. He would take that. He would take it and do what needed doing and keep doing it, one day at a time, until the accumulation of days became the kind of evidence that didn't need to be argued. Behind them, their children's voices carried down the corridor. Kalen asking something about the garrison structure, Lyra asking something about the kitchen. The two of them braiding the practical and the necessary together the way they'd always done, with the absolute confidence of people who had been raised by a woman who taught them the world was difficult and they were sufficient for it. They were. Riker had seen it in a settlement fence and a cellar window, and a boy who put his boots on in under a minute and asked the right question. The kingdom they were going to build, the actual kingdom, the one that deserved the name, was going to learn what it needed to know from those 2 children. From the girl who observed everything, and the boy who asked about sightlines, and the woman who had turned a forgotten border post into something that had held against a legal siege and an armed demonstration and the grinding weight of 3 years of solitude. Frostpine and Mooncrest. 2 territories. 1 charter. A set of protections that had never existed before because nobody with enough power had been willing to pay the cost of writing them. He would pay it. He walked out of the gallery and into the rest of it. The afternoon light was long and cold and clear, and ahead of him the corridor opened into the keep's main hall, and beyond that the gates, and beyond that the territory he was responsible for and was going to be responsible for differently now. Not from the comfortable distance of managed stability, but from the ground, where decisions had weight and the weight had names. Lyra's voice from somewhere below. "Kalen, there are stairs." Kalen's voice. "I can see the stairs, Lyra." "You were looking at the ceiling." "I can do both." Celine beside him exhaled. And this time the sound was full and clear, and it was a laugh, unmistakably, rising out of her for the first time in his presence, without being held back or managed or put somewhere. It was the best thing he'd heard in 4 years. He let it be enough for right now. Right now was where they were. It was a place to start.